Hello, everyone. Today I'm here with Boris Gamazaychikov and Philipp Hacker. And today we are going to discuss AI and environmental impact. And the paper they have recently published, The Global Landscape of Environmental AI Regulation from the Cost of Reasoning to a Right to Green AI. So first, I think that this is a very important topic because most people are not familiar with the environmental impact of AI. So there's a lot of energy being spent in developing and deploying models and talking about the latest AI capabilities. And there are some interesting discussions on AI policy and regulation, but we don't see a dedicated focus, or most people are not aware of the environmental impact. What do you think? What would you say there are the most controversial and the most misunderstood topics in this intersection of AI and environmental impact?
So something to understand about AI is it's not monolithic. AI is not one thing, and even our current conception of AI is very different from where it's going in the future. Taking a step back, AI has been a field for 70 or so years, since 1950, and what AI is and constitutes has changed dramatically over that time. The latest version, the current version, is known as generative AI. And what has underpinned that is a significant commitment to scaling up the data that's in these models, the size of the models, the amount of compute, the amount of processing that's necessary to train and deploy the models, and thus the energy, carbon, materials, water, and data center size needed for that. And so this philosophy of bigger is better is really what's dominating this flavor of AI. And it's not like, for the last 4 years or so since the launch of Chat GPT, it's not like we've reached a satiation point. These AI developers are still looking for more and more scale. And so that's what's the current data center build out is meant to satisfy, not today's models, but the models and the systems that are going to be deployed in 3 to 5 to 8 years. So I think that's the first thing, that AI is not one thing, and it's also changing kind of as we go.
Do you think that the bigger is better is still the mainstream paradigm, or it has been shifting? What's your personal opinion on that?
It's still the mainstream paradigm, and the dimensions of scale have shifted a bit. So initially it was just focused on scaling pre-training, so scaling that initial phase. They're still working on scaling pre-training, but now they're adding post-training scaling, so reinforcement learning, also scaling inference time, so test time scaling with reasoning models, and also agentic scaling, where agentic systems can spin up other agents, distribute the work, have swarms, and so forth. So now there's actually 4 scaling laws kind of stacked on top of each other that are all continuing.
No, I just wanted to add one or two wrinkles on that. There is also simultaneously, and that gives me some measure of hope, a race to develop small models, because it's becoming increasingly clear that routing every single query that you have, from what is my agenda today, to what was again the birthday of my assistant, when do I have to send the flowers, putting all of this through the latest GPT 5.5 or whatever it is at the moment, Opus 4.8, that's just going to kill your token budget. So there is a quest for small models, but again, these small models are incredibly trained and scaled and processed. So it's not the case that only because it's small, it's necessarily a boon for the environment. It's certainly better than a big model, but usually what you will have, and we'll probably get to this later on again, is that it's a combination, an oversight mechanism, orchestration layer, as it's often called, by a larger model, and then smaller models that are stacked below it for a specific task, for example. You asked about controversial and misunderstood things, and I think what Boris highlighted about the malleability and the diverse dimensions of AI is one often misunderstood item. What is particularly controversial certainly is data center build-out, and we'll talk more about this later on, I think, in the context of other also regulatory initiatives of a recent new initiative that we have in Europe, the Cloud and AI Development Act that just dropped 1 week ago on June 3, 2026. But what I find particularly illustrative and striking are two numbers. And that really helped me understand when should I use AI and when shouldn't I. So, for example, when you generate an image, there is research by Sasha Lucioni, our co-author, actually, showing that you generate one image with a leading image generator, and it consumes as much energy as charging your entire smartphone. So that is a huge bill if you think of 100 million plus users per day that are oftentimes just generating images for fun. And what's even worse is videos, because basically a lot of images one after the other. So I have friends who sometimes generate images, etc., just and videos particularly, just to play around with it, and I can understand it. But you should always, for these things, really keep in mind this has a huge environmental impact. And the second thing that people are often not aware of is that there is a huge difference between using a model in a reasoning mode versus a non-reasoning mode. So what we look at in the paper, and that's numbers that actually Sasha Lucioni and Boris came up with, are things that look at the distribution between a non-reasoning and a reasoning mode of the same model. And it can be that up to 700 times the amount of energy is used when you use the same model in reasoning mode versus non-reasoning mode. So that little toggle that you switch on there, think twice if you really need it, because if you don't, then you kind of save yourself and the environment a lot of energy.
And I think the majority of people, they have no idea. They never heard about that. And probably they would have a different attitude. No, don't you think? If you told,
I'd hope so. Yeah, at least it changed for me. Like in terms of, do I really want to generate a fun image for some kids or whatever? That's certainly not something I'm doing.
I think in general, you're speaking to how we're so abstracted with this technology. I mean, we are in general with software, with infrastructure, but especially with this technology, I think we're more so abstracted away from the physical reality. We think of the cloud, we think of this, I don't know, cloud brain of intelligence, but these are giant warehouses connected by undersea cables and transmission lines and gas turbines that are responsible for this. And I think just start trying to break down that abstraction so people are more mindful and more intentional about how they're using it.
It's nice that you mentioned it. So, last month I had a conversation about metaphors that we use in AI, right? So if you think about it's very anthropomorphic, and all the metaphors we use are analogies with the human brain, intelligence, artificial intelligence, and we think about those cute little robots. Probably a more realistic analysis would be a big data center, right? When you think about your chatbot, people would think maybe they have their favorite avatar, maybe they're using replica or character AI, they're just already more anthropomorphic, so they have a human-like figure. But more realistically speaking, it would be to imagine a big, massive data center consuming energy. So if you're asking, I was seeing people asking, okay, what is the capital of France? And then a massive amount of compute for the chatbot to use like a big machine to answer that small query.
Yeah,
and
or see a gas turbine blowing out, carbon emissions for your answer or something. Yeah.
And we had last month we discussed your paper with my AI ethics workshop, and one of the people, they raised a very important point. They said that when you think about environmental impact, for example, when you're buying a fridge, there are usually the labeling, right? So the green, so most people, we have the labels. So you go to the store, you're probably thinking about your electricity bill. So you say, I'm going to buy the green fridge, this electricity saving fridge or environmentally friendly fridge, because you will save money. And that is not happening at this point in AI, right? Maybe it's related to the current economic blueprint of the AI wave, but currently the consumer, the user, does not feel that if you keep using the reasoning model, or if you keep prompting to have more images, if you're in the the normal user, individual user plan, you're not going to pay more for that usually if you're not a big tech company. So probably that's part of one of the reasons behind people's attitude at this point, right?
Yeah, and we actually, Sasha Lucioni, my co-founder and frequent collaborator, both of us, her and I tried to create that, essentially the same exact rating mechanism that you see on fridges or cars or homes for AI. So it's called AI Energy Score. And, you know, it was launched about 1.5 years ago. The problem with that is, and we'll get to this, there aren't the incentives or governance structures or policies to force the model providers to actually disclose. So we have open models. So most of the models that are used and are relevant are closed. So we can get to that. But the infrastructure exists, the incentives and the pull from a regulatory perspective doesn't.
And where can people find this label that you guys developed?
Yeah, if you search AI Energy Score, you'll find the leaderboard and things like that.
Excellent. So
even with a traditional search engine, you don't need to use generative AI search for that.
That's something we could talk about that also. So, but that's something it's not possible anymore, right? So 2 weeks ago, Google announced this. We all saw it coming, right? The full merge. It started with, okay, a little bit of AI overviews, so only some queries, only in the United States. Of course, it was going to get bigger. They saw the threat from ChatGPT and Claude. People were using chatbots. Now it's becoming search, right? So if you don't want to have AI on search, you probably need to use the DuckDuckGo browser or any other specialized AI-free browser, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, obviously all of these machines are using some type of AI, but the concern we have specifically is about generative AI. And they indeed, at the outset, we thought in the paper we might be able to measure this more neatly. What's the difference between using a traditional search with, index-based or kind of good old school Google search? Think about this. And then vis-a-vis routing this through a standard LLM. It's hard to compare, again, because most of the browsers that we use on the search engines are closed. So as Boris just explained, we can't measure it directly. And there are numbers that the companies have put out, but those numbers are often vague, obscure, and it's hard to meaningfully compare. To give you an example, Google has published, and that's laudable. First and foremost, they have published some figures about how much energy Gemini conversation uses. Now, what they publish, however, is a specific statistical number. It's the median, and that means that that's just the middle, so that 50% of conversations will have a higher energy consumption and 50% lower. Why do you do that? Why do you not, for example, use the mean, which is the arithmetic mean? You add it all up and divide it by the number of conversations. Well, you use the median if there is a high statistical divergence. If it's the case that you have a lot of outliers that would somehow distort, as it were, the mean, so that the mean looks much higher, for example, because you have a lot of high-end conversations. Let's say the top 10% are just way, way, way above the otherwise median user. And so this is something we don't know. We can only suspect this to be the case, because otherwise there would not be a good reason for using the median rather than the mean. But it would be very helpful if we had that distribution, for example, the variance. And if we had not only the median, but also the mean and the mode, other statistical properties, to talk more seriously about, what does this mean, this kind of energy consumption? And because we don't have that, we cannot calculate the aggregate volume. We could say, okay, the median inquiry, yes, that has so many, and that's not too much of an energy that's being used per inference. But this keeps shifting as you add reasoning to the mix. It's maybe an X fold of what it used to be. And then particularly if you have these high-end users with multi-turn long conversations, agentic AI particularly, which uses up a lot of energy and tokens by distributing this and running parallel inquiries, So we can't really have a meaningful conversation. We can't really say, hey, folks, back in the days, we had this and this energy budget if you had the normal, your mean, energy, search query, and now we have it in this way. We did some back of the envelope numbers, and looking at figures that Google itself published and the number of queries that you have in search, we kind of figured out that it should be around 6 times the energy than it, with the new generative search than what it had back in the days. But again, that's with the big caveat. This is likely a significant understatement because it's only using the median number and it's not using all of those conversations that are potentially much above.
And in terms of this lack of transparency, are there other success cases in the sense of there was a new technology? At the beginning, the companies were not very transparent, but then there were policy efforts, were regulatory efforts, and then now today, a few decades later, we have more transparency. Is there any success case in that context?
I mean, I think we can. It's hard to equate other technologies with AI, but I mean, I think we've seen success in, lighting, for example, and in automotive. We've seen rating schemes in a lot of different sectors. AI is a bit different and a bit more complicated, but we've definitely seen examples.
What is the reason for this change? So mostly regulatory, policy, public pressure. What you would say is the main trigger to this, to more transparency?
There maybe one thing we can learn, because incidentally, I wrote my PhD on information provision in consumer and capital markets. And so basically this whole thing started as there were frauds in securities, so stocks that were offered to the public. And there was a need to inform about the underlying value, or at least the key parameters of the company that people would buy stocks in, so that they know what this is about. Just like the SpaceX IPO now that's coming up, they need to file a ton of information. And from securities regulation, this spread across consumer law, where now when you buy something online in the EU, you have this whole list of things that you can basically be informed about. You have big packages of information. People already speak of information overload. The interesting political economy behind it, I think, is the fact that regulators often, when they cannot agree on substantive regulation on the merits, for example, what kind of standards should apply to, say, a fridge so that it can be sold on the market, they say, hey, we can't really say anything about the substance, but so we give people information they can decide for themselves. So to a certain extent, we also need to be wary of this move that transparency can be used as a substitute for meaningful content regulation, which sometimes is also necessary. So we'll talk later on perhaps about other options. But if we take one example now from the data center debate, basically I'd say there's many policy options which we explore in different papers. But let's take two main ones. One is transparency. And it's about, how much do data centers consume in terms of energy and water? And even here we can see a huge difference. Is this in aggregate or is it per individual data center? Interesting thing. What do you think? Is it aggregate or is it individual that is disclosed? You would tend to think, hey, aggregate, that's interesting. How much do data centers in the EU consume per se, broken down by categories? This is something that the EU does do under what's called the Energy Efficiency Directive. But you would tend to think that it might be interesting for local communities also to know, hey, how much energy, how much water does this data center in front of my door consume? And maybe we need to, if it's excessive, maybe need to do something about it. Or maybe it's just fine. And this is something that people could know by information requests. You have these free information acts. And there was a new delegated regulation by the Commission. So the European Commission then publishes basically the parameters of what you can access in terms of environmental regulation under this energy efficiency directive. And there is a whole process of preparation of this regulation. And in that process, Microsoft and Digital Europe, so the main lobbying body of big tech, they made a submission to the Commission. and said, hey, folks, whenever there is data about individual data centers, that should be considered a trade secret, inaccessible by anyone. It's not put in the database. There is this EU data center database. It's not in there, and individuals cannot even ask for it individually either. And you know what the Commission did with this proposal? They copy-pasted it into the law. It's now Article 5.5 of this delegated regulation. That's really, I have to say, that's quite a shame. So individually, we have kind of a double deflection. We say, okay, we give you transparency, but only on aggregate, and individually it's all a trade secret, which I think is both conceptually and politically wrong, but it's also in blatant violation of actually an international law framework that the EU is part of, which is the Aarhus Convention, a convention on environmental information, where it specifically says in Article 4, trade secrets do not apply when it comes to emissions. That's information that needs to be made public upon request. So that's the transparency angle. And then just to finish this piece on the data centers, what I found really encouraging is a decision by the Irish utilities regulator. It sounds like a really boring agency, but it's actually the agency in charge of deciding who gets connected to the grid, to the energy grid. And in Dublin, for example, data centers make up not 50, not 70, they make up 80% of the energy consumption of the entire town. So there was a bit of a moratorium in Ireland to say, at the moment, let's give it a break here. And the regulator then came forward with certain criteria for connecting new data centers to the grid. And what did they say? They say that new data centers, they need to have renewable energy for 80% of their workload, and this needs to be additional renewable energy. So not from renewable energy sources from a wind park that's already there. It needs to be made newly available with renewable energy sources in Ireland. And there you can see, because the legislative process is stuck, there's a lot of infighting. There's obviously a huge amount of lobbying pressure. So in the legislative agenda, I'm very skeptical that we will see much progress, and we can talk later about the Coordinated Development Act, which is not overly ambitious in this respect. But then individual regulators can say, hey, you want a favor from us? You want access to our grid? Here are the conditions. And I think what Ireland can do, it's certainly not the least important country concerning digital companies in the EU. What Ireland can do, other member states can do. So a lot of the basically the gist is now, the momentum is now happening at the member state level and not at the EU level, because at the EU level, it's a bit stuck.
So everything happens in Ireland, and it's nice to see that at least in the utilities field, the agency is being proactive, right? In the data protection field, not so much, but here it's different. And when you were talking about transparency and kind of a bit of overburdening the customer, right, the user, you're saying, here the transparency, here all the information you need now, take a good decision, is up to you. It reminds me of the debate in the privacy field, like consent.
Yeah.
You say, oh, privacy is so important. It's up to you, the consumer, to choose. So here's a very long privacy policy. You please take your time to read all the privacy policies of the website you visit, and please have your best informed consent to the best extent possible, which means nobody has, that doesn't work, right? Professor Solov talks a lot about that. So telling the user or the consumer to decide is not really protecting privacy. On the generative AI wave, so I'll say the first ChatGPT was launched in November 30, 2022. Then, from a techno-social aspect, the generative AI wave started. Of course, AI is much older than that. The discussion, so we've been 3.5 years into this wave. And I wanted to know, do you think that the environmental debate has changed, one? And do you think, so Boris was talking about agentic AI and the new ways that they are, I'd say, scaling, right? Not only in the pre-training, but also the post-training, the agentic side of the technology. Do you think those decisions are in any way shaped by environmental concerns? And did it get better because of pressure, because of more research like yours? Did it get better if we compare 2020, end of 2022 with today?
I'd say since 2022, the conversation has shifted into much more awareness generally of the environmental issues. I think Back then, it was kind of a niche subject, and now, I mean, obviously, I'm biased because I work in this space, but I hear random people I bring up that I work in this field, and the public generally understands this topic kind of at a high level, which is really interesting and really not expected. I think early on there was a lot of talk from big tech that this is just momentary and these models are going to get so much more efficient so fast that this is not going to be a concern, and things have actually gone in the exact opposite direction. So it's pretty interesting. Things have gotten really polarized as well. I will say, I think lots of numbers on the environmental impact have also been taken out of context and have been used, irresponsibly to maybe paint all of AI with one lens. And that's been actually used by AI proponents more on the accelerationist side of things to poke holes in those numbers and to say, see, the entire environmental issue is overblown. There are these holes in this argument. So it's quite polarized, actually. And I think we need some really, we need some fact-based, science-based numbers. But it's not really arguable that you have these gigawatt data centers that are really impacting communities and a build out of gas, especially in the US, to support these data centers like we've never seen before.
And maybe just real quick, if you look at it on a global perspective, and this is something we also do on the paper, I think in the EU, there's this dual trend where at the one, and that was in 2024, this new delegated regulation, for example, came up with individual data foreclosed for data centers. At the same time, the AI Act was enacted, which has many imperfections, but at least mandates for GPI model providers and for providers of high-risk AI systems to give us, or not us, the public, that's not public, but at least to give the AI office an overview of the amount of compute that they use, and for GPI model providers also the energy for development. For inference, it's more contested, but in the code of practice, that's also included. It's not public, so it's certainly not enough, but at least now we have a first framework where this mandatorily at least needs to be somehow by companies, needs to be activated. They need to have compliance scheme in place to actually produce these numbers in a meaningful way. So that's, I guess, a good step forward, even though we could get much further. In China, for example, there is almost nothing in terms of outward-facing documentation disclosures, but they just do it. I mean, they just go full steam they have a lot of coal also, but they are really introducing a lot of renewable energies there, and part of their industrialization agenda. Something you can see very much on the global markets also, where they are becoming leaders in a lot of these technologies. And so this is really quite a different dynamic. It's quieter to the outside, but oftentimes pretty strict on the inside. And then if you look at the US, you have really this polarization between the federal level that tries to preempt anything, except for now with the latest move backwards, flip basically of the US administration, where they try to implement some kind of pre-release review for national security and cybersecurity perspectives or benchmarks. But then you have California, which tries to include AI and data centers into some of its general environmental regulations, scope 1 through 3 emissions reporting. So I think it's really quite a mixed picture. I would fully agree with Boris. It has made it to even the mainstream of the debate with different angles being taken. I think in the legal side, more specifically, it's very nuanced, but at least you can see that even in the Cloud and AI Development Act initiative, it is something that plays a role. So there are acceleration zones that member states, if this comes through, it's only a proposal at the moment, but if this comes through, member states need to designate certain zones for AI, for data center build out. And these acceleration zones, they need to be, their sustainability criteria and climate criteria need to be taken into account. It's not the only thing, but that's at least something. And also for the projects that are specifically then listed, they're called strategic projects, so more prestige projects given priority. There also, sustainability is one potential factor that can lead to such a designation. So it is something that otherwise couple of years back probably would not have figured at all, I would think, in a bill that's mainly intended to triple EU data center capacity within the next 5 to 7 years. That's the main goal. And so it's good to see that at least somehow in there. And it's also good to see that it's not preempting member state measures. That's at least how I read it at the moment. I think member states would push back very hard against any attempt, for example, to tell from the EU to tell the Irish that, their regulator can't make these conditions for grid access. So we see really a lot of diverging movements. Some is going into a hopeful direction, but a lot is actually just stalling on the legislative front, international.
No, I'll also add that we're seeing significant pushback on AI. In the States, local communities have blocked or canceled $200 billion plus of data center projects over the last 18 months or so. And we're seeing this not just kind of at the local grassroots community organized level, but also, in my work, I'm advising mostly large enterprises on using AI more sustainably. And a lot of the time they're coming to me saying their employees who are being told to adopt more of these tools are pushing back on these grounds. And so it's kind of coming up through their own customers, through the employees, through investors even. Probably, not kind of the mainstream US investors, but you are starting to see that. And so there is this significant pushback that's happening, and a general realization that the trajectory of AI right now is unsustainable. And that's not just from an environmental perspective, but as Philipp was saying, it's a cost impact. It's a over reliance on a few concentrated players impact. So sovereignty is a big concern here. And a reputational impact. In the States, it's been said that AI backlash is the most bipartisan thing since beer. So I think that's kind of hard to beat.
So maybe just one wrinkle to this. There was an interesting study published by the European NGO Algorithm Watch, in which they polled people on their attitudes toward data centers. And it turns out that when data centers are connected to renewable energy targets and are sourcing energy from there, then they're much more accepted in local communities, sort of unsurprisingly, but I think it's an important point to be made, than if that's not the case, particularly, of course, when you have direct impact from gas turbines burning toxic substances, etc. And so this is a point worth noting, I think, because for data center operators who are ultimately the ones that we also need to convince that this is important, this is, I think, a big competitiveness issue. Because if you build out a green data center, chances are you're not going to be blocked and harassed and litigated over by your local community, or is a much lower chance than if you don't do that. And I think this connect of showing people that it makes a huge difference on the ground, but also positively in terms of acceptance, because like it or not, some data centers will need to be built around the world and also in Europe. I think this is an important point mentioning.
I want to talk more about Europe and the omnibus and new proposals, but back on what Boris said, on the lack of nuance in the environmental debate. So this is not only on environmental issues, but in AI today, we often see, okay, you bring AI policy discussion or AI harms or discrimination or manipulation or environmental harm. And then people answer, yeah, but do you want the cure for cancer? Do you want infinite abundance? Do you want to reach the age where everybody lives forever? So that's the price, right? So kind of, okay, let's blur everything. That's the new age. That's the price for infinite abundance, kind of this intangible, unmeasurable utopian future that they sell is part of the hype. But then all the harm discussion gets blurred, and especially the environmental harm, which is more diffuse, more difficult to explain. No transparency, difficult to measure, and just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's important to, as we were talking about before, AI is not one thing. The AI that's curing cancer is probably not going to be the generative AI that your agents are using to code. And I think actually calling out a similar dynamic that started seeing folks that are concerned about the environmental impact and concerned about rightfully concerned about all the issues around big tech kind of being opaque. Those that are downplaying the effect that AI is already starting to have on the economy and the potential for it in the future, and refusing to engage with it. And there's definitely overhype, there's definitely oversaturation and overvaluation of a lot of companies. But I think it's actually not useful to totally to totally kind of not engage with AI and say it's just a bubble that's going to completely burst, because I think we've gone a bit past that, and I do think you need kind of more nuance to really understand how to engage and how to steer it in a better direction.
And talking about the AI Act, so the world's first comprehensive AI law enacted in 2024. Now we are here, 2026. It's already being amended, and Philip, I know, has been directly involved with the debates and the withdrawal of the liability directive we discussed last time. I wanted to ask you on the environmental theme. So we had many people, probably you also, had high expectations, right, from Europe. So we saw in the data protection field the Brussels effect. So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was enacted back in 2016, became fully enforceable 2018. It led to this regulatory boom. So many other countries, some of them copy and pasted provisions. So it became a regulatory reference. So it's nice. So it kind of raised the status of privacy and data protection to a fundamental right. So something nice, an interesting influence that the EU had. So many people were thinking the same way. Maybe we could see the Brussels effect in AI. Maybe the AI Act will lead to this positive wave of AI policy, and so especially related to fundamental rights, maybe environmental impact as well. So as you mentioned, it's basically regulated under the section on general purpose AI providers. And we saw so there are the transparency obligations and the summary. But I think that the guidelines went out last year, and then additional guidelines this year. I would say I was underwhelmed. I was expecting more. I was expecting the EU to set the standard higher. So more, I'd say, requiring more from AI companies. I want to hear from you, Philipp. So what do you think? What were your expectations? Do you think that the AI Act has delivered? Now with the omnibus, did you expect any changes on the environmental arena?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think when we started off with the AI Act negotiation process, I was not very optimistic, but moderately hopeful that it would be possible to put even more sustainability standards in it. That was infeasible. I mean, there's some in it, but to push for even more, for example, inference to be explicitly included. For example, environmental dimensions being mentioned as one of the risk dimensions that need to be identified and managed in risk management frameworks, both for the GPI models and for high risk. So those are some things you could have thought of. Bringing this in proved infeasible because at the end of the day, there was such a lot of, it was basically on knife's edge whether the AI Act would pass at all or not because of specifically German and French opposition to GPI model provider rules, that everybody at the end of the day was just happy this was, that we had something. And also when you talk to NGOs that are active in this field that are more aspirational, they also keep telling me that, of course, they had higher hopes. But at the moment, many persons, me included, are kind of happy that the sustainability parts were not touched in the digital omnibus on AI, because it would likely not have led to, a stricter regime, very much to the opposite. So what we now have is basically a system in place that is very imperfect because the numbers need to be produced, but they're not made public. There is a certain perhaps argument to be made that you could make these information requests and you might be able to get them. They're not shielded by a specific norm as in the data center case, which says, everything is trade secret. And there is also a possibility of arguing, I have argued at length for this, that environmental effects are part of the fundamental rights effects that you need to take into consideration anyways. They are a bit relegated to the second row in the GPI code of practice on security and safety. So model providers are mainly concerned about other things, such as loss of control, cyber offense, operations manipulation. But still, this is something that you can argue that they also need to take care of. And I think it will just take some time to see if, for example, in guidance that is forthcoming from the European Commission and then also from national regulators, particularly on high risk, because high risk implementation is with the member states. If some of these regulators will step up and say, "Hey, listen, folks, you know that, by the way, environmental dimension, that's one dimension of fundamental risk and fundamental rights risks in the EI Act." So it will take a little bit longer, but there is still a potential to draw this out of the structure in the EI Act that we have. A long story short, I think it was good that this was not something that was covered in the digital omnibus, in the AI omnibus, but because it would likely have made things only worse. And so now we're trying to work with what we have, and it would be interesting to explore potentially via strategic litigation to what extent you can actually get access to perhaps some of these documents that are only filed with the European Commission at the moment, and that are not open to public scrutiny at the moment.
So how do you see the self-regulation opportunity here? So in general, I'm skeptical of self-regulation, especially in environmental protection, right? So we have already some level of self-regulation, and they do their best to be as big as possible. So on that, so what is the role that self-regulation could play? I'd say this is important, especially in the US, where it doesn't look like there will be anything at the federal level. Also, regarding low and high environmental ambition, I think this is highly political, right? Of course, NGOs and researchers would love very high environmental ambition, and companies and some sectors of society would not have that higher ambition, would prefer have other priorities. So how do we find a balance in those concerns?
Yeah, regulation is kind of what we should be striving for, but in the interim, I think we need to be finding ways to put pressure on the companies and to make it, a financially good idea to do these things. And so, we are starting to see businesses, as I mentioned, they're starting to see AI's current trajectory as a big risk across a number of dimensions. So they're starting to put pressure on the AI labs, on the data center providers. First, I think transparency is going to be the big thing to push for, and I think it's a palatable and I think compatible with a lot of different worldview kind of request. And so transparency will be the first thing, and then the idea is from there, hopefully various market signals, demand signals can incentivize the right behavior across different dimensions. Ideally, actual regulation would step in, but I think we have to look at kind of the reality, the dynamics right now.
No, sorry, just adding on to this real quick. I think what we can see in the US, at least, we have some stuff in California, for example, which then sometimes has a big impact because it regulates all the companies that are operating in California, and particularly, of course, companies headquartered in California are prone to follow these laws. There's environmental reporting, for example. And in the EU, self-regulation in this field, I think self-regulation per se is entirely a failure in the digital realm. But what you have is what's called regulated self-regulation. And the code of practice is a good example of this, where actually some experts sit together with stakeholders, they'll look at ways to implement this, and then industry can sign on, and they have an incentive because there is a presumption of conformity. Basically, you're meant to be compliant with the law if you comply with these sets of rules that are laid down in much greater detail in the code of practice. And I think this exercise is really useful. Why? Because it doesn't help anybody to have a really ambitious regulation if industry in the end doesn't follow it, and then it takes years and years of litigation to bring them in line. And what we unfortunately in this realm, I think you need to have some kind of buy-in from industry and from the main providers, because without them, it's just very, very hard to enforce this in a command and control style of way. Imagine the European Commission. They can't even effectively internationally enforce the AI in terms of, they can't seize the property of Anthropic in California or enforce access to the latest model in California. It's just unimaginable, the commission saying, hello, Trump administration, we have a problem here with the AI. Can you please let us in and provide some, a collaborative loyalty on, it's just not happening. So in that case, we need to somehow find that sweet political spot where we have a certain buy-in and goodwill on the side of the companies, paired with this sticks and bones approach, where you basically stick carrots and sticks approach. You have that carrot of the facilitated compliance regime, and that comes through this regulated self-regulation. But it's also clear that you're bargaining in the shadow of potentially harsher enforcement if that fails. But mere and pure self-regulation, indeed, I think is just a history of a lot of ink that has been spilled that wasn't really worth the paper it was written on.
I would say in Europe now, probably the political appetite is in the opposite direction, right? Buzzwords now are, simplification, business friendly, innovation. We want to be, Ursula von der Leyen said, the AI continent. Those are the new buzzwords. Fundamental rights, not so trendy anymore. So don't say so much of that. I want to talk about some of the policy approaches you propose, which are very interesting, especially the part about rights. I found super ambitious. So the three main areas of policy approach. So specific transparency mandates to address information asymmetry. So we spoke about transparency, user rights to rein in externality that markets alone cannot internalize, and international coordination to mitigate regulatory arbitrage. So there is a very nice, very interesting part of the paper that you talk about right to use green digital infrastructure. I found it fascinating, and it includes three different rights. So right to use search without generative AI overviews, right to use digital infrastructure without unnecessary Gen AI components, right to use the green model. So this is very ambitious because the mainstream tendency is the opposite, right? You see Google, if you use any Google product, if you open your Gmail, it's help me write, use AI to write, use AI in your Google Drive, use AI for your Google Docs. So everything is, even the thing, we've been using those products for decades now. Suddenly we need AI. We cannot write anymore. We need AI to help us summarize a one paragraph email. And so I have a question. So first, I wanted to hear from you. I know that the role of researchers is to propose a future, even if that future does not exist yet. As Carissa Velli says, it could be a prophecy, right? You talk about it and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe it will become true earlier. One, is that, pragmatically speaking, do you see those rights happening? I say, do you see any, maybe there is a place in the world where you see that could happen there, and then other countries will follow suit. Also, do you see that the people have enough awareness to be interested in those rights? So I see, maybe I'm each one is in their own bubble, but it looks like to me that still people are very interested in AI, and I see it, like productivity, all those buzzwords. So I want to learn to use agentic AI to become more productive, to grow as a professional. And those rights, it looks like they are against the mainstream AI first trend. So how do you see that? On one side, the feasibility of making those rights a reality, so legally mandated or legally possible rights, and how do you see the buy-in from people, from users? Do you see people seeing value in those rights? Are the majority of the people, are they ready? Are they interested in those rights at this moment?
So to start off with, I think, yes, politically it's a difficult moment, but you're right in us trying to push our imagination and open windows where perhaps before people weren't even talking about it, and that can shape discourse. There are a number of rights that you wouldn't expect to find somehow in certain texts, such as the DSA, which has a right to basically a non-personalized feed from a very large online platform or search engine, which is also something that goes entirely against the trend of hyper-personalization, etc., content pushing everywhere. And they managed to put it in there. So I'm not hopeful for the next 2 to 3 years, but maybe if you look, further into the future, where, as Boris said, there is a significant backlash both against AI content, AI slop, and against some of the local effects. If that continues, and I'm quite sure it will, then legislators at one point in time might actually, come back to these proposals simply because by popular demand, let's say. And I think similarly, as you start educating people about the environmental effects of AI, oftentimes people then ask me, okay, so what can I do now that I know that this actually consumes much more than I thought? And this is one practical thing. You can even do this on your own if you want to. You can do just some research and try to see, disable the reasoning mode. Use, if you are more tech savvy, use a local model that's really small and use that. So you can do some of this on your own. And then other stuff, I think, might also come in via industry practice. If enough people talk about this and start demanding this as users, then companies do what users want, and they're paying clients. And if paying clients, us customers, want this toggle about a green model, maybe magically in 1 or 2 years, maybe it appears next to the more reasoning, deeper research, etc. toggles, which is not impossible to implement. I think, particularly with the energy score that we already have. So yeah, it's part utopian vision and part it's realistically shaping ambitions, shaping expectations, and also giving people just something to do that they could possibly do. Even if they don't have a right, they could still act as if they had such a right.
And I think it's important to think about and understand why we're all of a sudden, as you said, getting AI buttons everywhere, from, I don't know, Zoom to Google Slides to anywhere it can fit. It's because there's so much data center build out happening that user numbers and user counts and token throughput is needing to be maximized to justify those costs. So rather than, yes, there is authentic demand, authentic demand on use, but also there is this inflated demand from these traditional products being injected with AI. So I honestly think a pushback against that would give us a better picture of the economic conditions of AI, and which I think would release some of these bubble concerns and could make for a healthier ecosystem in general.
And my last question to both of you. So, Boris, do you use AI, and are you optimistic in general, not only about environmental issues, but optimistic about AI, the future of AI?
But I think it's important to understand the tools, the models. So I engage with AI, kind of from almost from an academic perspective, just to understand the capabilities. And it is really amazing to see the capabilities improve, in a relatively short amount of time. And I think it's important for folks to at least kind of test these tools out. I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I think feeling like everything is predetermined and set on a pessimistic route is self-fulfilling. And I do think, especially at this moment, I think we're quite early on this AI trajectory, and I do think we have power to steer it the right way.
Thank you. Philipp?
For generative AI, more specifically, I do use it from time to time. For example, if I need to get a brief overview of a field that I'm really not quite aware of, and then gives me some URLs, condensed version, can be very helpful, actually. I think it's getting better, much better at this, less hallucinations, which is also something you can see in the academic literature. But more specifically, what makes me hopeful is that the current path, as Boris said before, is entirely unsustainable. And not only from an environmental, but also particularly from a financial perspective. But because at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to for many of the investors. And the token prices will have to rise so steeply that I think they will have to start considering, and they are already starting to consider, smaller models, more task-specific models, to a much greater extent. We have these rebound effects. So overall picture for AI environment and sensible use, I'm not really convinced that this will be a very, very positive story. But I'm still determined to make the little that I can to contribute to making it more positive than it might.
Great. It's good for our mental health also to be optimistic, right? So there are so many possible dystopian futures. That is good to believe in good futures. Thank you so much, Philipp and Boris. So for the audience, please download the paper, The Global Landscape of Environmental AI Regulation, from the Cost of Reasoning to Right to Green AI. So the link is in the comments. Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Philipp.
Thank you.
Thanks so much
Appreciate it.
for an inspiring conversation. As
And I
always,
see
Luiza.
everyone else in the next episode.